Do not look away. What you are about to hear already knows your name, and once it begins, it does not release those who listen. Before the knives, before the rope, before the crowd learned how to breathe together, there was a silence imposed by power. Hugh Despenser the Younger rose not by merit, but by proximity, not by law, but by appetite. He stood beside a king who mistook intimacy for governance and loyalty for justice. In that space, England learned how quiet tyranny can be. Lands were seized with parchment and seals. Rivals vanished through courts that spoke softly and punished completely. The word lawful became a veil. Those who felt it tighten around their throats remembered, even if the records later pretended otherwise. This story is not merely an execution, it is a ritual reversal. A kingdom deciding how much pain must be displayed to cauterize a wound it allowed to fester. Despenser understood symbols. He wore them, exploited them, and sharpened them against his enemies. When Queen Isabella returned with an army and a son, the old language of obedience collapsed. What followed was not chaos, but calculation. Every step toward Despenser's end was measured, rehearsed, and meant to be witnessed. As you listen, mark yourself in the margins. Leave a trace of where you stand as this unfolds, not as confession, but as proof of presence. Those who are seen endure. Those who remain unseen are edited out. You already know the pact. It requires acknowledgement, not applause, and it binds those who continue together, while others drift into absence. Captured in Wales, Despenser was denied the mercy of speed. Chroniclers disagree on certain details, but they agree on intention. He was to be unmade in public, stripped of name, title, and protection. The charges read aloud were a litany of power abused, corruption, treason, the poisoning of justice itself. Whether every accusation held is less important than the message carried by their recital. Authority had decided he would embody all sins at once. The road to Hereford became a corridor of anticipation. The crowd did not rush. They waited. Waiting is the purest form of control. By the time the scaffold appeared, the door behind you had already closed. You were inside the judgment now, and there would be no appeal. History watches without blinking, recording obedience, fear, and the cost of silence itself. They did not kill him immediately. That would have been mercy, and mercy was not the purpose.
The purpose was correction, not of the man alone, but of memory itself. Hugh Despenser was paraded as an object lesson, moved slowly through hostile territory, so that resentment could ripen into certainty. Each mile rehearsed the same truth. Power can be revoked, and when it is, the body pays for what the law permitted. When he reached Hereford, the stage was already built. The scaffold stood high enough to be seen, low enough to feel intimate. This was not theater for nobles alone. It was for everyone who had watched Despenser prosper while others starved under fines and seizures. The crowd was instructed by custom, not shouted commands. They knew when to be silent. They knew when to look. Silence was as important as the blade. The sentence followed tradition, but tradition weaponized, hanging to announce guilt, drawing to deny wholeness, the rest to ensure that no fragment of him could pretend to survive intact. Chroniclers soften the language, but they do not deny the sequence. He was stripped of the signs that made him untouchable. Titles vanished first, then dignity, then the illusion that proximity to a king could shield flesh from consequence. Some accounts record that his punishment included the removal of what symbolized his alleged corruption of the royal body. Others hesitate, unwilling to confirm what everyone present understood. Dispute here serves only to reveal discomfort. The crowd did not argue. They watched, and watching completed the ritual. The message required witnesses, not agreement. What mattered was not the pain itself, but its ordering. Each act followed a logic meant to reverse assent. Where he once controlled courts, now ropes controlled him. Where he once confiscated estates, now his own body was partitioned by authority. This was governance expressed without parchment. The law spoke through hands and tools. When death finally arrived, it was not the end of the process. Pieces were sent outward, nailed to gates and bridges, reminders placed where trade and travel passed.
Erasure was incomplete by design. His name would persist, but only as warning. England did not forget Hugh Despenser. It learned how to remember him properly, with fear disciplined into instruction and obedience carved into collective sight. Those who understood this lesson survived quietly, speaking carefully and teaching their children restraint through fear.
They wanted the lesson to travel farther than Hereford, beyond the reach of the scaffold, into the habits of the living. So the pieces were sent outward, carried by riders who understood their burden. A head above a gate was not decoration, it was grammar. It taught how sentences ended. Merchants passed beneath it and adjusted their voices. Clerks copied records with steadier hands. Fear, once distributed, became administrative. Despenser's fall exposed the machinery that had elevated him. The intimacy between king and favorite had been spoken of in whispers, because whispers preserve ambiguity. After the execution, ambiguity was no longer useful. The chronicles sharpened. They described influence as infection, counsel as seduction, governance as captivity. Whether these descriptions were precise mattered less than their timing. They arrived when power needed a reason to discipline itself without admitting guilt. Queen Isabella and Mortimer did not dismantle favoritism, they rebranded it. The boy king learned early how to watch adults bleed for his instruction. Authority did not repent, it recalibrated. The spectacle had warned the court that excess visibility invites annihilation, while quieter control survives. Those who learned this lesson prospered, those who did not vanished politely. The crowd too learned. Participation was not optional. To look away was to align with the condemned. To watch was to accept the verdict as necessary. This is how collective violence becomes civic duty. The execution rewrote memory by forcing agreement through presence. Even those who doubted later repeated the story in the approved order, because disorder carried risk. Disputed details linger like bruises. Some sources disagree on sequence, others on severity. This disagreement is not evidence of mercy, it is evidence of fear. Writers softened what they could, preserving themselves by omission, but the structure remains visible, a body converted into policy, pain organized into precedent. Despenser's name endured as a caution, not a complexity. Complexity would invite sympathy, and sympathy corrodes authority, so he was flattened into an emblem. Children learned it, officials invoked it. It became a boundary marker, warning where ambition must stop. England moved forward, not cleansed, but instructed. The silence that followed was not peace, it was compliance, rehearsed daily, and guarded by memory sharpened into thread.
In that compliance, history found its preferred witness, a public trained to remember selectively, speak cautiously, and survive by consenting to lessons written on bodies rather than parchment and crowns fall. Time did not soften the lesson, it normalized it. After Despenser, punishment acquired a vocabulary that everyone understood without instruction. Power no longer needed to shout. The memory of what had been done carried the weight forward. Judges spoke calmly, juries listened closely. Men adjusted their ambitions inward, learning how to want less publicly while desiring more privately. This was the true inheritance of the execution. Edward II was already dead when the narrative settled, removed with similar discretion and similar warning. His end, like Despenser's, was debated in detail and obscured by caution. England learned that uncertainty itself could be useful. When methods are whispered rather than declared, fear becomes personal, adaptable, impossible to challenge. The crown survived not because it was just, but because it learned when to be quiet. Mortimer would eventually fall to the same logic. Power always eats its tutors. When he was seized and executed, the pattern repeated with less extravagance but equal intent. No one mistook this for coincidence. The system did not collapse, it refined itself. Excessive spectacle became unnecessary once the audience was trained. What remains most disturbing is not the brutality, but the efficiency. Despenser's body was not destroyed in rage, it was processed. Each step corresponded to a category of crime, each wound to a legal idea. Treason was not an abstraction, it was something that could be pointed to, described, and replicated. Law moved from page to flesh and back again, improved by demonstration. Later generations would romanticize resistance and sanitize governance. They would speak of reforms and charters, of progress measured in ink. But beneath these narratives lay the scaffold shadow. Everyone knew where the line had been drawn. The absence of frequent executions did not signal mercy, it signaled success. To remember Hugh Despenser accurately is to resist comfort. He was neither monster nor martyr. He was a functionary who mistook access for immunity, and a society that corrected him publicly to preserve itself privately. The inhumanity was not accidental, it was calibrated, and calibration is always more unsettling than chaos. You are still here because the story permits it.
You have witnessed what was required to make silence effective. The final chapter does not offer release. It only clarifies what listening has already cost. The last lesson does not belong to Despenser, but to those who survived by accepting what his ending authorized forever. Violence succeeded because it was shared, witnessed, archived, then reused quietly as permission for future decisions without debate, mercy, appeal. The crowd dispersed carrying an education that required no schools, only memory maintained through fear and repetition over generations obediently. Law regained authority by demonstrating it could enter bodies, rearrange them, and leave meanings nailed above roads for travelers everywhere. This was governance teaching itself restraint by overcorrecting once, so that restraint afterward appeared humane, while remaining absolute, unquestioned, efficient. Remembering becomes dangerous when it threatens the lesson, so history trims edges and calls it balance for public survival narratives. Discomfort is the signal you have understood, because understanding replaces outrage with calculation and caution in governance, memory, speech, ambition. Executions fade, but instructions persist, encoded in procedures, promotions, and the quiet spacing of dissent across institutions, families, courts, centuries. What was beyond inhuman was not pain, but consensus agreeing pain was necessary to stabilize authority, discipline memory, silence, compliance. Such agreement requires witnesses who remain, repeating the order of events until doubt feels unsafe to voice, record, teach, imagine. Despenser's scattered remains were temporary, but the arrangement of fear they taught was durable, within law, ritual, administration, obedience, survival. When later rulers spared bodies, they still spent this memory to secure compliance without blood, spectacle, crowds, records, apologies, witnesses. You feel the weight because it was designed to cross time and settle here inside listening, judgment, patience, attention, endurance. There is no resolution offered, only alignment with how power prefers its lessons learned, quietly, collectively, repeatedly, without consent, relief. If you speak of this, you will choose words carefully, honoring the instruction embedded by example, fear, law, time, authority. If you forget, the system still functions, which is its final proof of success, efficiency, discipline, inheritance, permanence, silence, order.
This story ends without comfort, because comfort weakens memory and invites repetition of excess, punishment, spectacle, authority, consent, fear, control. History keeps what works, and what worked here was making obedience visible once, then invisible, everywhere thereafter, indefinitely, quietly enforced. You have passed through the door and felt it close, exactly as intended by designers, witnesses, chroniclers, rulers, courts, memory. Leave now carrying the knowledge that silence survives by teaching others how to watch, endure, comply, remember, repeat, belong, remain.